Thank you, Julie. I think it's interesting that the paper on rural courts is introduced by a court administrator from Los Angeles. Not that California doesn't have rural courts, but you won't find them in LA County. I don't have PowerPoint slides. I'm going to talk with you, and I hope you're going to talk with me, ask questions anytime along the way. You people sitting over there seem awfully far away, but I know you're not going to listen to me when I tell you to come over here, but that would be a good idea if you decide you want to do that. I appreciate that my personal experience has not been with rural courts. Although I'm the court administrator in New Mexico, we have lots of rural space, fifth largest state geographically, only 2 million people. That's not a lot of people to fit into a space that big. I didn't write this paper by myself. It was a collaboration with court administrators from 4 different states. That would include North Dakota, California, Michigan, and Louisiana. And it's true in any event that every state has rural areas that are differently served, need to be differently served than our urban areas. And that's really what the Conference of State Court Administrators wanted to address in this paper, which we adopted at the end of 2018. It was also adopted by the Conference of Chief Justices. And really, the paper's broken down into 2 areas. One, define the challenge, talk about why this is an important topic, and then more importantly, talk about what's being done in some places, how opportunities you might be able to recognize that might broaden the access to justice in your rural areas in ways that you hadn't thought of, or give you a link to someone whom you might be able to talk to here at NACOM or on the phone to talk about things that are being done elsewhere. That's one of the kind of policy papers we write, a paper that tries to identify resources really to give us, state court administrators, and NACOM members, folks who have to actually manage courts on the ground, the ability to find out what's going on elsewhere and maybe to help address problems that you have because 2 heads are better than 1. And sometimes instead of reinventing the wheel, it's nice to get somebody else to give you a wheel so you can get your bicycle going on down the road. So with regard to the challenge, really, the challenges arise from the things you would think of, geography, limits on technology, and the things that are happening in our rural communities, which is decreasing population, less economic opportunity. But we still have folks there, and there's no reason they're not entitled to justice, the same as the people who live in places where it's more easily accessible. So, what do we mean by rural? Well, we looked at the census. The census says if you got an incorporated municipality or a county with less than 2,500 residents, it's rural. Well, you know, I grew up in New Jersey. There aren't many places that fit that description. Then I moved to South Jersey, and I found out that there's lots of places that fit that description in the state I grew up in. In fact, 97% of the land area of the United States is classified as rural by the census. 97%. That means we squeeze a lot of people into that other 3%. And there's a lot of places where you go a long way from here to there without running into very many people. And that's true. If you've driven around the West at all, you'll know that that's the way the Western United States is built. Oddly enough, though, the state with the highest percentage of rural population is Maine, about as east as you can get before you go into the ocean and head for England, right? 60% of the population of Maine is rural. Because although they have Portland, they don't have a lot of population in Portland relative to the whole state, so there you go. You're sitting here in Nevada. Nevada has a little more than 3 million people. Over 2.6 million of them are in 2 counties, right? Washoe County, which is Sparks-Reno area in the northwest, and of course the Las Vegas metropolitan area here in Clark County. That's 2.6 million people, about 87% of the population in 2 counties. Then they've got 16 other counties plus Carson City, which is it's an independent city. I don't exactly know what that means, but it's like a county, except they don't call it a county, they call it an independent city. I don't know what's going on there. But that's where everybody else lives. It gets even stranger when you think those areas I talked about, those 2 counties, the population, that 2.6 million people, they live on about 7/10 of the land mass, about 150,000 square miles. The other 110,000 square miles that make up Nevada have the other 13% of the population. That's not unusual. Those people, they have to go to court, they have problems, they have divorces, they have debt issues. Of course, they have criminal cases, and they all need a place to go, a way to resolve those. And it shouldn't be so much harder for those people to deal with those things than those who live in Reno Las Vegas, for example. Interestingly, they had a county called Bullfrog County. They created in 1987. The legislature did. But in 1989, the Supreme Court, state Supreme Court, declared it unconstitutional. I don't know what was going on there, but it has nothing to do with rural versus urban, although it was a rural county. But it's interesting when you start looking at the histories of our different states. In any event, a lot of people off concentrated into limited areas, just like you think about maybe in the east. With regard to that, if you looked at the paper, there's a map overlay, right? It's got the outline of North Dakota. It's the right size, but it covers, we stuck it on the East Coast, sort of the I-95 corridor. And it covers New York, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Pittsburgh. 37 million people live in that area, covered by North Dakota, which has 700,000 people, right? Very different challenge to deliver justice in North Dakota than in, you would think, for example, Pennsylvania, except that Pennsylvania has two big cities, Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. They're located at either end, right? And in the middle, there's a lot of farms. There are farms and a lot of people living in small communities that, again, have the same challenges to access to justice that you would think of. But it does underscore that it's a big country, and there's a lot of places where there aren't that many people living out there. With regard to population decline, we have about 60 million people that live in rural areas. That's about 20% of the country's population. They live in that huge amount of space that's not coastal or one of the big cities. In 1930, that was 44%, and that decline keeps going down. It's actually now down to about 19.3% of the population is in rural areas. And along with declining population, declining opportunity, there's fewer attorneys. There are 6 counties in South Dakota with not a single attorney, 12 counties in Nebraska. You can find them in my state. We might have 1 attorney in some of our counties. It's a tough place to practice and to make a living. And so the attorneys go where there's more people and their practice can do better. Between 2010 and 2017, urban population grew 6.5%, rural population went down 0.5%. Steady erosion of population. Employment, same thing. Down 4.3% in rural areas, up 7.5% in urban areas. So people are leaving those rural areas. It's also aging. Wheeler County, Oregon is about 3 hours east of Portland, Multnomah County. It has a county seat called Fossil, interestingly enough. In Fossil has had a 40% decline in job opportunities. It's also got a median age of 56. Multnomah County, where Portland is, the median age is 36.1. So rural areas also tend to be older. That has implications for how you deliver justice to rural areas, right? Because I'm using data, I'm not using my own biases. They tend to be lower adopters of technology. They tend to be people who favor person-to-person communication. And because that's an older population, you have to craft what you're doing to try to meet them where they are. And, you know, this is what happens in your states. Half the jobs in Utah are concentrated in the Wasatch Range between Provo and Salt Lake City. 2/3 of the jobs in, sorry, that's Oregon, sorry, in the 3 counties around Portland, sorry. They have half the jobs there. That's 3 out of 36 counties. Not a lot of economic opportunity in the other 33 counties. And in Utah, it's 2/3 in the area between Provo and Salt Lake City. So naturally, that has an impact on the population and what you can do. Many of your states are county-based funding. We're state-based funding, except our courthouses are provided by counties, but otherwise it's all general fund tax money. So it's a little easier to direct resources to the counties that might need it in different ways when you're talking about rural communities. That's not true in a county-based system. If you have a rural county, like Wheeler County I was talking about in Oregon, not only is their population older, their jobs are fewer, their tax base is lower. I was reading about a particular county in Kentucky, eastern Kentucky, where they've been hit really hard by the opioid crisis. And while their population's gone down, their tax base has gone down, they have less revenue, the need for services has gone up. Ambulance services, medical services. These counties are looking around for how they're going to pay for things like basic medical services. They're not that keen on ramping up the resources available to the court system. Sometimes you have to find solutions without necessarily seeing a lot of resources. Technology is a challenge. The natural inclination when I started on this paper, when the conference selected this topic, was we fix all this access stuff with technology, right? We'll put them on video, we'll get them on internet. Well, it turns out that about 23% of the people in rural America have no access of any kind to broadband. It's hard to reach out to them if they're waiting for the, you're probably old enough to remember dial-up. If you're not, you see it in the movies, right? Where you sit there and you wait for the modem to catch up to the internet, and God help you if you want to download a picture, you should go have lunch, and when you come back, maybe your picture will be there. These folks don't even have access to broadband, so how are you going to use a technological solution for them, particularly in their homes? Michigan, the figure is 37%. 37% of their rural constituents don't have access to broadband internet at all. So that's a challenge. And then there's cost, as I said, population down, some of the other service requirements are up, aging populations, things like that. This isn't confined to courts. These challenges are not confined to courts. The Anchorage Daily News published an article on May 16th of this year about the fact that in a third of their villages, that's what they call their incorporated towns or villages, they don't have any law enforcement officers at all. Not that they don't have a place for them, they don't have them at all. And it's hours, if you're lucky, days in many cases before law enforcement can come to the community. You can imagine the kind of problems, which are detailed in the article, that causes. 70 of these towns, villages, are big enough to have a school and a post office. You have to have a certain population for that. And yet they have no law enforcement of any kind. I read a follow-up article this weekend on this topic in Alaska. It turns out about a third of those officers in those villages actually wouldn't pass a background check. They have criminal histories that would disqualify them. But I guess in a kind of a don't ask, don't tell, if we can't get anybody, we'll take somebody. But you can imagine the kind of challenges. And that's true across all kinds of government services, as well as medical services, social services, not just the courts, in terms of how we get resources into these communities effectively. All right, so we all know that's a problem. It makes sense. It's logical, right? What are we going to do about it? There are a couple of different ways that you can address this with regard to opportunities to provide better access to justice in our rural communities. And I think the one we start with is technology. Where you have technology, it can be a great leveler of access, or a way in which you spread your use of resources out in a way that allows you to keep resources in a community that might not be able to justify the expenditure otherwise. So we could wait for the federal government to get around to it. Last year and this year, the government, they held an auction last year. They're holding another one this year. They're going to sell about $6.5 billion worth of 4G bandwidth, as I understand it, that you have to license. That's all great. The people who buy that, they're not spending $6.5 billion so that they can bring technology to the small towns in my state that don't have internet. They're bringing it to places where they can give you faster downloads for movies, and people can watch Game of Thrones and that kind of thing. They're not taking it out to the places we would like technology to reach for us to be able to deliver court services. You can do something like what Nebraska did. Nebraska partnered with the court system, rather, partnered with the Department of Motor Vehicles and the Department of Health and Human Services to increase the availability of broadband services in their two most rural counties. That's a little redundant if you've been to Nebraska. Anybody from Nebraska? I've been there. And there's a lot of farms, spread out people all over the place. But they took the two most rural counties and they said, let's put broadband, let's make it accessible to the towns that we have out there. And they increased obviously the ability to use on the court side, video technology for appearances, for court hearings, for the provision of interpreter services, which you'd be surprised, or maybe not. In rural Nebraska, there's a need for interpreter services. A lot of people who work on farms don't have English as their primary language. And so when they get involved with court, you need interpreter services. You can send an interpreter out there, but you're going to spend a lot of money and time sending people out far away. In my state, we have made some robust use of video remote interpreting, because places where we can connect to, I have qualified Spanish interpreters in Albuquerque. I have needs way across the state in places like Clovis, which is on the Texas border, They don't have any interpreters in Clovis, New Mexico. And I used to send my interpreters from Albuquerque over to Clovis, about, I don't know, 2.5, 3-hour drive. They do their hour-long hearing and they drive back, and I'd pay them for 6 hours of driving and an hour of interpreting and spend a lot of money, and we'd solve one problem at a time. Now, they sit in a room in offices I have in Albuquerque. They get in front of a piece of technology, video technology, and they provide services to courts in which we've placed technology that makes it not as good as a human being, but pretty good. And you have different channels. You can have them discuss with a defendant and the defendant's attorney rather than the whole courtroom issues and things like that. And they can do that for an hour on the video with Clovis, and then they can spend the other 6 hours doing it in Albuquerque or on video with Las Cruces or some other place where we have need. So, you know, they did this in Nebraska, and it helped those other state agencies that wanted to deliver services out there to be able to do so from a remote central location, and it helped the court as well. Not that that's a complete solution, because sometimes some things can only be done person to person. I don't send interpreters remotely to do day-long trials or 2-day trials, or trials, actually. We send human beings to do trials. But for hearings and all that kind of thing, things that are shorter, we're happy to send them over video. In 2018, California committed an investment of $300 million to provide technology infrastructure into its rural counties. They spent an additional $30 million to help people sign up for access to the technology. Because when you don't have technology out there, when you don't have the internet, somebody coming in and saying, oh, we gave you fiber optic, you have 4G now, you're like, you know, apparently that doesn't really tell people what they need to know. So they sent people out there to the tune of $30 million to explain to people how this could help them get access to services they might want, let alone all the other things that people use the internet for. Same thing, the Kentucky Wired program in 2018, the state committed $110 million to provide internet services out in rural areas, $100 million in Colorado for IT infrastructure in 2018. If you're lucky enough to live in a state which has too much money laying around, or you can provoke your legislators and your governor into being interested in sending infrastructure out to rural areas, great, that's wonderful. Obviously, that's not something that the courts can control. When I meet with my Supreme Court, on the top of the list is not get more internet access out to the areas we don't have very good internet access to. But the state also wants to deliver services of all different kinds, and you can partner with them to make it happen. That's great. It's also important, I think, if you send technology out to your more rural areas, that you have services that are centralized in a way you can deliver them to those communities. So we're talking about, I mentioned interpreters. I can't have an interpreter a half an hour away from every courthouse in every county, the 33 counties in my state. But I can have a bunch of them in Albuquerque under contract who kept very busy providing those services from their location in Albuquerque out to the community. So you have to centralize those services in order to be able to deliver them in rural areas. It's a little counterintuitive, right? But it's what works. Minnesota created a payable center for their traffic citations, right? And they staffed it up with people, and all their payables now go to this centralized payable center. And it's located in a remote area. I think it's about 2.5 hours away from the Twin Cities on purpose. They put it out in a remote area because they could create jobs out there, and because they have a technology that allows them to do everything centrally, they can put it pretty much anywhere they want because they're on the same statewide case management system. That's true in my state too. That really made it possible. If you're interested in this kind of thing, if you're looking at collaboration with your partners on the state side, on the executive side, you want to look at, there's a footnote in the paper, footnote 37, gives you a link to the Alaska Justice Ecosystem Project. And in Alaska, they went out and did effectively a kind of a gaps analysis. What don't we have and where don't we have it? And how could we collaborate with people in other fields of public service to maximize the ability of people to reach us or for us to reach them throughout Alaska. Alaska is off the charts, obviously, in terms of having challenges with regard to rural areas. You know, it's not surprising that they would have undertaken this project. And the mapping of it is really interesting. The things that they're doing in terms of trying to create hubs to which people can more easily get services from us, the courts, and also from social service agencies and medical. Telemedicine is really one of the ways in which we've seen a lot of pioneering about delivery of services remotely. You would think a doctor has to put his or her hands on you to figure out what's wrong with you, right? Well, in many cases, they really don't. They can deliver expert medical services to you remotely. We have a project at the University of New Mexico where they staff all kinds of cases every week. They pick an area and they do it interacting with the doctor who's wherever he or she is, and you get the benefit of the entire UNM medical staff, where they have our biggest hospital, staffing your case without having to come in and lay out your slides and have everybody look everything over and interact with them in person. So you can collaborate, as I said, with those people on the executive side. That's technology. Technology is great if you can get it. Good luck. And some of our places, it is a solution, and it's probably the most cost-efficient way to deal with some of the challenges of our rural areas. But it's not always the most practical, and it's not always the one that people want. Turns out, not surprisingly, you survey people, they trust, to the extent they trust government, they trust their local government a lot more than they trust their state government. And they trust their state government a lot more than they trust the federal government. And if you tell them, we're gonna hook you up with a judge who's sitting over there in my state, up there in Santa Fe, and you're talking to some rancher out in Lee County, that good old boy or gal is gonna shake his or her head and say, these people don't have a clue what goes on around here, and I don't want them deciding my future, my legal issue, whatever it is, because you know what, they got odd notions up there. I hear what goes on up in Santa Fe. And I bet that's the same thing people say about Carson City when they're out there in a rural area of Nevada, or maybe in your state. And it's not illegitimate. I mean, we have a Sixth Amendment right to a speedy, fair, and public trial. How are you going to have a public trial in your community if your trial is 150 miles away or 200 miles away somewhere else? So it's important to recognize, and this is something I didn't really appreciate very well until I started going out in communities and talking with people, how deep the feeling runs that the people here are the people I trust to decide what goes on with me. And that is not an insignificant thing. When you think about it, it's really amazing that there's so much compliance with judicial orders, right? A judge tells somebody, you're now divorced, whether you want to be or not. Your child is in the custody of your ex-spouse, whether you want that or not. Your land is going to this person, or the value of that business dispute is X. It's half of what you wanted. And instead of ignoring it, they, despite their unhappiness, they comply with those orders. Why? Because they believe the system is fair and they had a fair shot. And they believe that a lot more if the person telling them that is somebody in their community, from their community, somebody they voted for or have known. And so it's really important to keep that in mind. So you can put the resources in the community to the degree you can afford it, and you can afford it more if you do things like what Alaska has done by court rule. They set staffing levels for rural courts, and they said, we're going to put a person, a human being, in a lot of these locations, and we're going to have circuit magistrates or part-time magistrates that are going to be able to be there 2 days a week or something like that, or every other week, depending on how remote they are. Because at the very least, we've got a physical presence in the community, or fairly close to the community, and the judge will be more likely will be from that area than if we only staff up with the full-time judicial resources that we can afford, and we put them somewhere and make people come to them instead. I think it's really important to keep in mind. Another thing the survey showed was that people would rather have the services of a paraprofessional than a lawyer, a member of the bar, if that person is in their community, rather than having to travel to see a lawyer. It's really important when you talk about what resources we can afford to put in communities. Maybe we really can't get attorneys to practice out there, but maybe we can develop programs that will put trained paraprofessionals with limited abilities to give legal advice, not full-fledged, what attorneys are able to do, but it costs us half of what it costs to have an attorney. If that's a resource that people would rather have, if it's local, rather than having to travel to talk to an attorney. Here's something that Nevada's done. Since we're in Nevada, I thought I would talk a little bit about them, so I have. And Nevada did something really interesting. They created something called the Rural Courts Coordinator. As far as I can tell, it's a person named Jamie Graddick. Jamie's not here, right? Jamie's in Carson City, or probably out in, I don't know what little towns there are, Area 51, I don't know where. But, you know, helping some rural community get access to justice. And I thought it would be helpful to quote for you what their website says is Jamie's job, because it's interesting to me that the Supreme Court of the state of Nevada decided this is a resource we need to have in court administration. So here's what it says. Beyond the bright lights and glamour of Las Vegas and Reno, there is rural Nevada, more than 100,000 square miles of open land dotted with towns where hardy folk find and cherish unique lives. That's very kind way to put it. A major goal of the Rural Courts Coordinator is to find ways to provide the same access to justice in those rural counties that is available in the urban cities. The Administrative Office of the Courts, Rural Courts Coordinator, aids communities in identifying and fulfilling judicial resource needs. I think that's, you know, really significant, because I have about 40 part-time jobs. One of them is to think about how we can give access to rural areas, and there's, you know, 39 other things that I might be doing on any one day. I don't have somebody in my office whose job is to think about how we can better serve people in our rural communities, and whose success in their job depends on how successfully they provide access to justice in rural areas. I think it shows a really important recognition by the Supreme Court of Nevada, and I hope that Jamie has great success in efforts to achieve what the website says is going on. I think the job is just several years old now, and didn't get a chance to follow up and see how things are going. But if you really think you have a challenge in rural areas, you might think about whether your court, you could talk to your state court administrator, or whoever would be making the decision in your state about doing something like this, and maybe you want to get in contact with the Nevada folks and find out how it's working, whether it's having an impact on getting resources outside of Reno and Las Vegas to the 87% of the state where there's not the same level of resources and people. It's interesting, I don't know if the Rural Courts Coordinator was responsible for this, but one thing Nevada did was they created 2 new judicial districts in like 2012. So, you know, we have multi-county districts in my state. We have 33 counties, covers 300 square miles. So we have some really big districts that have really few people in them, but they cover huge areas of the state. 7th Judicial District's the best example. It's enormous. It's got 4 judges, and those 4 judges travel great distances regularly to serve their communities. And people have to travel distances to get to the courts served by those 4 judges. But in some cases, in many cases actually, people living in those counties are geographically, physically, closer to a court that might be in Doñana County, which is Las Cruces, or another county. And but we have our county lines, and we have our districts drawn by the legislature, and so the 4 judges work very hard to serve the constituents within their district, which they get elected in, rather than, you know, sending people across a county line to somewhere else, because they can't really do that. You're restricted from being able to do something like that. And so what they did in Nevada, they took a district like that and they cut it into 3 districts. They reduced travel time very significantly, and there's still there's still a disparity between the amount of travel time the urban judges have versus the rural judges, but they brought it down by over 20%, and that means those judges are in court providing judicial services to people rather than passing each other on the road trying to cover this previously much bigger district. Your courts may be able to redraw the lines themselves. They may have to ask the legislature to do it, but it doesn't cost any money. They didn't add any judges. They gave individual judges more responsibility for a smaller area rather than as a whole district having to, you know, cover a vast amount of land. They did something like that in Minnesota. They have the 7th and 8th judicial districts. Minnesota has lots of little counties all over the place. And they combine the 7th and 8th districts for administrative purposes. There are 41 judges in this combined district, 23 counties, little ones, and they have a single court administrator and 9.65 FTEs. So I got 10 people running all those courts. What that means is, as opposed to if you broke it up into smaller districts or you had administration in each of those 2 districts even, you probably can't justify a full-time human resources administrator, a full-time fiscal, financial person who understands the budget and how you try to get money out of the legislature, for example. But by combining them, they do have full-time staff that are fully qualified. It's a lot harder to get someone to work half-time who's really highly qualified than to have a full-time person. So even though they cover a bigger area and they've got all those counties and 41 judges, they are able to have a professional staff serve those people rather than if we stuck to our jurisdictional boundaries and said I need a full staff in the 7th and a full staff in the 8th, which we're not going to pay for. So we're going to go along with half-timers and part-time people and things like that. We can restructure courts even if we can't get the legislature to do certain things or provide more resources in ways that can broaden our ability to serve our rural communities. We have fun rules like venue, subject matter jurisdiction, these kinds of things, right? Venue is at play when I was talking about our 7th district and not being able to send somebody from somewhere in that giant 7th district who might only have to go 20 miles to reach a court in Las Cruces, but might have to go 120 miles or more to reach the court that's in their district. But they can't, because by our venue rules, they have to be heard within the district that we arbitrarily drew up sometime in the past. They did pass a statute in my state, for example, that when the law enforcement officer issues a citation, he or she can issue it in the adjacent county, if it makes more sense. There are places where you're driving through Doña Ana County, which is where Las Cruces is in the southern part of our state, and you cross a little piece of Socorro County, which is in the 7th district. If you happen to get pulled over, I'm not talking from experience, this is hypothetical. When you're crossing that part that's in Socorro, if you get a traffic citation and you don't happen to live close to Socorro, you have to go all the way back up, I don't know, it must be 150, 180 miles. But if you write that citation into Doña Ana County, you're 22 miles or something away from the courthouse. Because in Doña Ana, which is kind of long and skinny, you have Las Cruces in the middle, and we have courts in the north side and the south side. So you can get to that north side court pretty easily, if the officer is in a kind enough mood to write it into a different county. In Minnesota, they have an interesting venue rule on criminal matters. If you get in front of a judge and the judge discovers that the defendant in front of the judge has multiple cases against him or her, and they're in multiple different jurisdictions, the judge with the most serious crime, I don't know how they decide that, they're fighting over this defendant, the one with the most serious crime can consolidate all the cases from the other districts into that one court and resolve everything together. That's pretty smart. That's a total violation of the venue rules as we understand them traditionally. But I'm guessing the defendants appreciate it, as do the attorneys who have to handle the cases, as does the court, which uses one judicial resource to handle multiple cases, rather than having to have different activities going on all over the place with different judges. Same thing is true with regard to subject matter jurisdiction. There was an effort for a while for courts to consolidate levels of court. I don't know if you have this in your state or in the courts that you're responsible for. You can have municipal courts, and you can have limited jurisdiction courts, and you can have your general jurisdiction court, and they might not even be in the same towns in the county, and people don't know where they're going. They have to go to court. To them, court is wherever they find the court. They don't realize that they're all different. They may be run by different people and have different jurisdiction. Courts have been working in some cases to consolidate. California did it in 2000. It was done in Vermont in 2011, New Hampshire in 2012. Try to make it easier for people to at least know where they're going, to put the jurisdiction of whatever it is you have to resolve in one place instead of slicing it up, depending on what kind of problem. Is it worth $5,000? You have to go over there to that town, to the limited jurisdiction court. Is it worth $20,000? Well, you have to go to the district court in another town. It doesn't make sense to people, and it doesn't make sense to me either, but it's the traditional way we structured our courts. In Michigan, they decided to have concurrent jurisdiction plans, they call them, which allow different kinds of judges, probate judges, circuit judges, and district court judges to all have the same overlapping jurisdiction. So, you know, a probate case is usually a death case, although probate means different things in different states. Let's say it's when someone dies and you file an estate. But maybe it's much more convenient for your citizens to go to that probate court, even though they have a civil matter, some other civil matter that isn't strictly within the probate judge's jurisdiction. If there's an agreement among the judges that you can handle these kinds of cases, then that probate judge can handle your civil dispute with your neighbor. And a lot of our citizens will find that more convenient, at least if they're in Michigan, to resolve it rather than have to drive all the way to the other side of the county or maybe a different county, depending on where the jurisdiction otherwise would be lodged for that kind of matter. So we could deal with things like venue and subject matter jurisdiction. Sometimes we have an opportunity with regard to where we put our judges. In a lot of states, you're required to have a judge in every county, or the legislature decides where judges go. That's not true in North Dakota, where the judicial offices are created by the Supreme Court. And there's a vacancy, they can move it from here to there, depending on if they need the judge more in one place than another to have the judicial office. Nebraska does the same kind of thing with its Judicial Resource Commission in terms of creating and locating courts. That's different than most states where the legislature will have to make those kinds of decisions, which having gone to the legislature to close courts, which I have done, it can be the most logical, sound, fiscally responsible thing to do, but you're going to have a senator and a representative whose court is located where you want to close it, and guess what? They're not going to be very happy with you. And the legislative process, you may succeed, I have. You may fail, I certainly have, in trying to close courts that don't have value and maybe put those resources in a place where they have greater value. Because after all, no matter how badly we want to give you a court in every town where we're going to have people who are going to have disputes, we can't. And, you know, good luck with your legislature trying to convince them to close one somewhere that could be more usefully used, those resources, in another place. But one of the things that we can do, there's that management consolidation thing like I talked about with Minnesota, but one of the things we can do is move work around. If you have the ability to send work from where people are really too busy to where they have more time, more resources, you can do that. In my state, we're on the same case management system statewide. So if I have the authority to do something in your case, I can do it in Santa Fe, and it's going to show up in your case even though you're in Silver City, which is 280 miles away. Take you about 6 or 7 hours to get there, right? That's a great thing. So if the court in Santa Fe is overburdened and the court in Silver City has a fairly light workload, light enough that I'm thinking, yeah, we got to cut staff, maybe we want to move that court somewhere else where we have more people, I can not do that. I can keep from having to do that if I can send some of that work electronically down to Silver City and have them relieve some of the resource needs that I have in Santa Fe. And we've been doing that a lot, particularly in our limited jurisdiction courts, which have wildly varying caseloads. I have a county in which I have a limited jurisdiction court that has about 50 cases a year, 50. They have a full-time judge who gets paid $95,000 a year and a staffer who gets paid about $75,000 a year with salary and benefits. And I have courts where the judges are carrying 4,000 cases. Well, some of those 4,000 now go to the court that has 50 so that the staffer doesn't get bored out of her mind, for one thing. And actually, she's very good. She just happens to live in a place where there's a lot more cows than people. And she can do an awful lot of work. And it makes it easier for me to justify having that position there than otherwise for 50 cases. And the same is true for that judge who travels a lot to neighboring towns outside her jurisdiction to provide services, judicial services, where they're needed. Even though that judge might not be from the towns that we tend to send her to, she's a rancher. She's going to courts that are largely serving ranchers and not serving Albuquerque people. And so you have less of that challenging trust factor than if, you know, I sent somebody down from Santa Fe to go out there and decide cases in some of our rural areas. So you can do that if you have the ability and if you're willing to work with other people around the state who manage their local courts to spread the work around. And as a court administrator, I've certainly tried to facilitate that because it makes it easier for me to justify resources that are costly in areas where I might not otherwise be able to do that. And a last way we can affect better access to justice are court appearances. You can allow people to appear telephonically. I know not everybody has internet, but almost everybody has a phone, and even in our most rural areas, the phone works a lot of the time. We do have dead spots in my state, maybe you do in yours, where you just have to keep driving until you get a signal. But it is easier to appear by telephone or by video if you have the capability, if you have the connectivity, than it is to drive all the way somewhere for a 30-minute hearing. You can allow lawyers to appear remotely, you can allow litigants to appear remotely, and you can have judges who appear remotely. And it's a lot like those video remote interpreters. It's a lot easier than having everybody have to get together. They do some of this in, here we are in Nevada again, right? In civil and family cases, the default is the parties appear, for everything not a trial, by telephone. Unless the judge orders they personally appear, they're going to appear by telephone. They have similar rules, a little different but similar, in Utah and in Alaska, to allow people to appear other than in person. You can always come in person, I suppose. The judge won't kick you out if you show up, but it makes it a lot more convenient for especially for short hearings that are necessary, but it's an awful lot. It takes a whole day for you to go to court. If you can do it by telephone, it'd take you, half an hour, an hour, depending on how long the situation lasts. I talked with Milt Mack, he's the court administrator in Michigan, about a rule they have, and he said that about half of their mental health hearings occur by video. That's important because if you have somebody in a treatment facility who's got court involvement, if you've ever seen the impact that has when the sheriff shows up to transport them in the police car or in the van from the jail van goes out to the mental health treatment center and brings them to court so they can have a half an hour hearing on something, it's not good for the person who's in treatment to try to deal with various issues. When they can appear at the facility where they're getting treatment by video, okay, it's cheaper and it's easier and we don't have to use police resources to transport people. It's also better for the people involved, for the person involved. And if you can get your court to adopt rules that allow you to do that kind of thing, I say go for it. More power to you. It's a win for everybody. And we're doing that some in my state, and I hope we can do some more of it. All right, those are things we can do. We can also work with people. Either we can do it or we can work with others to try to attract resources into rural areas. How are you going to do this, right? It's a challenge. In Georgia, 70% of the attorneys in Georgia are in Atlanta. It's sort of like a reverse donut, where all the lawyers are in the middle and then all around it. Georgia's not, I mean, it's not a western state, but it's pretty big. And that whole area all around Georgia, till you get near Savannah, there's no lawyers out there anywhere in all those counties. They don't have a public defender's office. There's real challenges with getting legal representation outside of the Atlanta area unless you want to travel. In Arizona, 94% of the attorneys are in the two largest counties. That would be Pima, which is Tucson, and Maricopa, which is Phoenix. 94%. Arizona is a big state. It's like 300 square miles. And all their lawyers, 94% of them are in their two cities, right? They're not out there anywhere else. In Texas, 83% of the attorneys are found in San Antonio, Austin, Houston, and Dallas. Okay, those are big cities by any measure. But Texas is really big. What, 262 counties? Is that what you got? 64. 254, right? Those cities are in one county each. So that means they got 250 where they got to share 17% of the attorneys in the state. And that includes places like El Paso, which has got 700,000 people. It'd be the biggest city in my state if it moved north of the border. Not that I'm suggesting that we want El Paso people or anything. Dave's the court administrator for Texas, so I got to be careful here about disrespecting our neighbors to the south. But that's not a lot of lawyers for an awful lot of area that needs to be served, right? So what can we do? South Dakota does something interesting. They provide an annual subsidy. If you promise to go for 5 years, you sign a contract with the state. 5 years, I'll have a practice in rural areas, and they have rules that define what the rural areas are. we'll give you $12,500 a year. Now, in Los Angeles, that might not be enough to get someone to move across the street, I don't know, but in rural communities where practice is challenging, that could make a difference, and they're having some success. Maine proposed a tax credit 2 years ago for rural practice. It failed, but they tried. That's an interesting approach to me, to give someone a tax break for practicing in rural areas. Student loan repayment seems to me a logical place to get younger practitioners out into the community. They have a program where the state actually funds this in Nebraska. It's been proposed in Arkansas. And having 2 young daughters who graduated from college and then from graduate school, and their friends, this is on their minds. It's like number one on their minds, right? These people aren't getting married because they have so much debt that they're worried about carrying that debt along and how they're going to deal with it. If you can say to a law student, we'll pay back your student loan if you'll commit to X number of years practicing in rural communities, you can attract them to at least give it a try. Other ways that you can try to get people out into your rural communities, there's summer clerkships. So when you're in law school, you go 3 years. You have at least 2 summers where you need to find some kind of work to do between semesters in school. And clerkships is one good way to do it. They send folks out into rural areas to get a taste of practice working with attorneys in rural areas. They have programs like this. And this is all, of course, identified in the paper in Iowa, Oregon, and Nebraska. Maine has the Rural Lawyer Pilot Project, which you send law students out in the summer to shadow practicing rural attorney. Remember, 60% of their population is in rural areas in Maine. They've got the law school in Portland. They send them out trying to give them a taste of the good life in rural areas so that maybe they'll be attracted to practice out there. I read an article this year about an attorney who was retiring. I think it was in South Dakota in this case. And they have the people who moved out to these rural areas, there was more population then, they set up their practice, they lived there, okay, they stuck it out. But they're retiring, they're leaving the practice, they're getting older. And there's nobody behind them to take their place. None of these young kids moved in. So what this attorney did was, he went down to the law school and he got a person, a sharp clerk, had the clerk come out for a summer, decided it was worth a shot and said, tell you what, you come work for me, in 3 years, I'll give you my law practice. The common thing is I'll sell you my law practice, right? I want to close it up, I'll sell you my client list. You're way ahead of the game rather than investing what you have to develop your own client list. If you work for me for 3 years, I'll give you the practice. And it happened, that's what it did. That's maybe the only way that this practice, which served a whole bunch of very sparsely populated counties, was going to get an attorney to set up a practice in South Dakota. Nothing the government did. This practitioner decided this was a good idea, and it turned out it worked out to be a good idea for him. You've got a lot of folks trying a lot of things. I mentioned Maine. They just had this May symposium at their law school. Actually, it was in April, ensuring equal access to justice in Maine's rural communities. And they got a bunch of lawyers and other people, government folks, together, and they spent 2 days talking about how we're going to deliver services out in our rural communities. If you think your law school would be cooperative, it'd be a way to get the conversation started or advanced on how we're going to deliver services in rural areas. Other ways you can do this, librarians, we have law librarians that go out and train librarians on how to help people get access over the internet, because a lot of libraries maybe are the only place you can get internet access in some communities, how to access legal or judicial resources through the library. But the law librarians are going out and training the lay librarians, regular librarians, in how to do this. I mentioned paraprofessionals. Washington has a program called Limited Licensed Legal Technicians, LLLT. These are basically paralegals with additional education who are able to do more than a paralegal would do without violating the unlawful practice of law rules that the bar has set up. The same thing is happening in Utah. We're working on developing a curriculum with our community colleges to do exactly this, so people can give limited legal advice and representation in our state, even though they're not attorneys, because we can get more of them out in the community than these people will see if they wait for an attorney to show up. New York has a Rural Law Center of New York. So there's 44 of their 63 counties. It's been there since 1998. It's funded by IOLTA, the Interest on Lawyer Trust Accounts. If you don't know what that is, ask one of your attorney friends and they'll whine at you for a while about IOLTA. And bar dues support the lawyers serving those 44 rural counties, and they've been in business, I think I might have said this, since 1996. Various nonprofits that send law clerks out to rural areas, and a lot of these are talked about in the paper. Some are federally funded, some are nonprofits that are at work. You can find them, and there's references to them in the paper, and they can give you models for maybe to build on if you want to start some trouble in your area to try to get more legal resources there. In the end, you know, our conference felt that it's part of our job to elevate the conversation about access to justice in rural areas in our states, and also to try to identify resources for those of us who would like to do something about this, but we don't have the time or the ability to go out and figure out what could be done in my community that might help. There's all those big scale things. Yeah, sure, give us more internet, $300 million, that's great. But there are small scale things you can do too, like maybe we should make it easier for people to drive 20 miles to the court that's in the county next door because they're in the northwestern part of the county, rather than having to drive 200 miles diagonally down the spine of the county, because that's where we happen to put the courthouse back in 1930 when we put the courthouse there or decided what would be the county seat, things like that. It's just a matter of thinking a little differently than our traditional thinking has been anyway about access to justice. So you have any questions about any of this? Is any of this, oh yes, please ask me a question. I'll try to answer.
So for the judge that you have that is the ranger that travels to courts outside of your jurisdiction, how do you get that local buy-in where they don't know her so that they trust that ruling that you were talking about earlier?
I think there's a couple of things. One, oh, sorry, the question is, I mentioned a judge I have that travels from her county court where she has very few cases, and we send her out to other courts so she can serve as a judge. So I can justify paying a judge $95,000 a year to do 50 cases, right? And how do you get the community to buy in, to trust that person because they're not from their county? By definition, she's going to other counties. And one of the ways I think I mentioned was her background is very similar to the background of the communities in which I try to focus her work, right? That's the eastern part of our state is very rural. There's a lot of ranches, and she's a rancher. That's where she comes from. Also, familiarity can breed trust as opposed to contempt. We send her to the same places repeatedly. So to a lot of people who show up in those courts, she's the judge, right? Where you have a one-judge court, in our state is particularly liberal about letting people disqualify the judge. So they'll decide their local judge is no good because, you know, I beat him up in high school, so I don't think he's going to be fair to me. Okay, now we have no judge, right, for that county. Well, I can send this judge in there. And because that happens routinely, because she gets to appear in the courts a lot, she's there a lot. So I think that helps. But you can't do this unless the Supreme Court writes rules that let you move people around, you know, because I don't have otherwise, if it wasn't for the Supreme Court, I wouldn't have the authority to send someone out of the county in which they got elected to sit in another county.
How do they get, oh, that's really loud. Okay. How do they get that initial knowledge, though, that she's a rancher to begin that buy-in? Is that something, like, does she slip that in as she's starting the thing, or is there permanent court staff there that doesn't travel with her that's part of the community that sort of, you know, slips that in when they're coming in and they're doing their scheduling and stuff?
Yes, on the local staff. Also, this particular judge has been a judge for, I don't know, about 20 years. But as a person who grew up in an urban or suburban community, the minute you start talking to her, you know she's a rancher. And I have worked a lot with our legislature. If I don't know where the person is from, I'll know in about 2 minutes after talking with them whether they're from the Rio Grande corridor, which is where all of our population is in our big cities like Albuquerque, or they're from the more rural and outlying areas. And their issues are very different. They talk about different kinds of problems, and that's what this judge is, you know, I mean, I don't know, they know. Any other questions or concerns? We got one over here. We want to make sure you get your exercise, so you can go all the way over here. So next, somebody over here, raise your hand.
One of the things that I think, and I haven't read your paper, and I'm assuming it may be covered in there, but the juvenile court clientele, the problem that you're very familiar with in New Mexico, the closing down of juvenile detention centers, and a juvenile who has an allegation pending in, say, I'm just picking it because I'm not sure this is true, in Las Vegas, New Mexico, being housed in a detention center in Albuquerque where the jurisdiction and the venue for that person's case is in a different county. Is there anything in your paper about how you address the use of facilities to hold defendants or children pending their cases when they are held, so that they're not traveling across vast areas of real estate to be held and then traveling back to where their case is going to be? And I know that some of the technology is used, but attorneys who defend these kids, of course, grumble about that. I don't have an opportunity to meet with my client face to face if they're appearing telephonically from or closed circuit TV, whatever it is, Skype, from Albuquerque, and the case is in Las Vegas, New Mexico. How is that being considered in this rural jurisdiction, rural justice concept?
We didn't address it specifically in this paper, and you're really talking about pretrial. Two of the things that we have done in New Mexico is we use a lot of technology to try to make it so they don't have to move as much. But you're going to face this anytime you're in a relatively large geographic state. You're not going to have juvenile detention facilities in very many places, right? So you have to send everybody to one place. The other thing we've done is try to release as many of them as possible. So the percentage of juveniles that we're holding now is remarkably lower than it was, say, 6 or 8 years ago. And that's true on the adult side, too, for criminal defendants. There was a time when our detention center in Albuquerque was so crowded, we were sending people who had been arrested, hadn't been determined that they were guilty of anything, to Texas to be housed in Houston. Imagine how easy it is to talk to your client when they're in Houston and you're in Albuquerque, right? And it was very expensive because the jail was so crowded. We let a lot more of those people out now because they're not dangerous, and it's actually good public policy to release them. But that's a whole different paper on pretrial release. But I think that's probably the best answer. If they're going to be detained, there's nothing you can do about that. There's going to be that problem because you're not going to have a detention center in every community where the juvenile comes from. But to the extent we can decrease the level of detention, and a lot of data shows we really over-detain juveniles, let alone the adults. Let's develop public policy that in our courts that release many of those individuals. They'll do better and will be better off, and they'll have the opportunity to consult with their attorney in their community and be home rather than in a facility that, they're necessary, but that doesn't mean they're the best setting for juveniles to affect more positive behavior.
Have one last question here.
Hi, I'm Sarah Lindahl-Pfeiffer. I'm the court administrator in Minneapolis and Hennepin County, Minnesota. A lot of the Minnesota examples were familiar to me. In Minnesota, we do have struggles with our interpreters, and we're working on remote interpreting, but I'm wondering if anybody in the group has, or if you learned anything in the paper in addition to just remote interpreting that works to get the interpreting services out in the rural areas. In Minnesota, we have a particular challenge because many of our interpreters live in the Minneapolis area, and so we either are paying a lot of travel time to folks to get them out in the rural areas, or we only can do the remote interpreting as the alternative. And so I'm wondering if there's any successes or things that people are piloting to try to meet those challenges in other areas.
We got an answer over here. I can tell you in our state, we purchased a lot of technology. It wasn't easy because the judges at first, they want their person there, right? They're used to having. But now they're very happy with the VRI because it's a lot more accessible to them. Also, we developed a lot of online training for people who speak different languages. Spanish is our most popular, but there are other ones, to try to qualify more people. And when we're lucky, they come from a place of real need rather than one of our urban centers. But you have an answer.
Yes, what we do have limited Spanish interpreters in our area. Most of them have moved, but however, we have utilized the one from Austin that you can log in or call in immediately. But you can also make a reservation ahead of time. But as far as those languages like Burmese, Samoan, Romanian, we have utilized another online program, and then they can call in, because those, we did need some that had to fly in, like one was a Burmese, and of course we had to pay travel and hotel and such for trial. But motions and pleas and things like that, we do use telephone.
Yeah, that's what we'll do. We'll fly them in for trial, often from California, which has an amazing diversity of language and very robust interpreter services. They're unionized, which it makes it another different challenge. But we'll fly them in for trials. But we'll do it by video if we can, telephonically if we need to. It's really the only way to go. We can't be sending someone to speak Tagalog for 20 minutes when it cost me $5,000. I'll run out of money real fast for the majority of interpreter services I need to provide.
You didn't mention court reporting services, but I work with a company who provides remote court reporting services in many of those rural, widely geographic areas, when we can assign a reporter in the morning in Arizona and put them in Colorado in the afternoon. That helps alleviate some of those issues for the courts of record.
How many of you have human being court reporters still in your courts? Wow, I'm shocked. At least half. Because because of the inability, they closed down the court reporting school in my state. Almost all of our districts now use digital audio recording. And we make transcripts of those few cases that get appealed when we have to. But out of necessity, we couldn't get court reporters, no matter what we paid them, to work in all of our different communities. Albuquerque is the exception. We still have court reporters there.
All right, well, that is the end of our session. Thank you, Artie
Thank you.
Pepin, for a wonderful presentation. I'd like to thank you all for joining us and for your participation, and to